Roland.
Thank you. Great presentations. My question goes to you cannot find a shift which is maybe recent 30, 40 years ago. The production started to go market-wise, maybe to find another types of crops. And my feeling is to go back a bit to Aswan's dam, where state irrigation was employed. We were talking now about not adequate food production, which was usually, they ended up being self-sufficient in some kind. Egyptian with cereals and cattle having pasture due to flood irrigation, due to floods of the Nile, and now there's nothing about that. And this goes back to the power knowledge which came up with Nasser. I'm going back to Waterbury's writings, which came up with the Aswan's dam changing the whole landscape of production and the mode of production of the agricultural production in Egypt. Can't you relate the Aswan's dams changing, shifting the agriculture into what we are having now?
Well, it doesn't a priori change it towards the crisis that I began to highlight. I mean, there's no necessary relationship between building the high dam, the transformation of the flood irrigation, and the mess that has emerged since '87 and the process of economic reform. I think there are two bigger issues, if I can say, at work. One is the attempt to develop the Western Desert in Egypt with Toshka.
The Tennessee Valley Authority was a prototype of the Nile, or whether the
well, I mean, I think what has happened is that, I mean, again, on a priori grounds, I would not say one should be against projects. One should be against big projects. The Toshka project is particularly lamentable because it was promoted without any environmental impact assessment, and economists, agroeconomists in Egypt who tried to promote the environmental impact, many even trying to do it informally to publicize at the time of its inception, were really kind of rubbished and erased. I mean, the Toshka was basically Mubarak's white elephant. This was to be his bequeath. The other issue related to that is, of course, that Toshka, the one estimate is that between, in the last 20 years, Toshka has sucked in something like $85 billion. $85 billion. Now, if one looks at what it is that money could be used for in terms of developing the delta or even other smaller scale new land development, the mind boggles. So it's actually sucked out spare liquidity to generate effectively kind of geostrategic alliances that Mubarak tried to promote with Gulfies for the export of high-value, low-nutritious foodstuffs from Toshka to the Gulf and to Saudi. The other issue, of course, is that one of the main consequences of the Toshka Dam is that it has, for many years now, undermined the efficacy of irrigation in the delta. So farmers have begun to be very critical of the flow of Nile waters for irrigation, which they've directly associated with Toshka. I mean, Habib is very much a hydrologist, and I'm sure he can add to that. But I think it's not per se that I want to say that schemes are a problem, but these have to emerge through a process of democratic consultation, as well as a scientific appraisal of what the consequences of it are. And I think at the heart, and actually I don't think we've used this word democracy at all today. And perhaps we shouldn't be surprised at that. But actually I think what is missing in the way in which farmers are so rubbished and marginalised is an understanding that actually they not only have felt needs, of course, that everybody is a human being, but there has to be a procedure whereby ideas can be expressed and articulated, and they can combat and set agendas of production.
Can we just, and then we can come back so it doesn't become a dialogue. But just, Ray, you know why we don't use the term democracy a lot, by the way? We don't use it because we have developed an allergy to it. Because usually it comes painted on drones. So we don't like it very much. So that could be one reason. At least that's why I don't put everything in it. But do we have other? Yes.
One thing is the political military elite and how it affected the landscape.
Which has changed a great deal.
Sure, I understand. I just want to raise the fact that the intellectual elites have also kind of over time, and I don't know why this happened exactly. Perhaps the new liberal discourse, and this is not just the case in Yemen, but all over the world, is not restricted to the region, also adopted a lot of the development discourse and gave up on even following the issue of agriculture. I mean, if you look at the literature of dominant literature in the region, even the literature that's critical of the regimes and the practices. So the issue was just abandoned, the issue of agriculture. And I wonder if you or other colleagues on the panel have looked into what happened there. I mean, is it just there was a dominance of one set of issues over other? Is it just uncritical adoption of new liberal discourse on the subject of development? Is it their own upper mobility into the middle class and abandonment of the
I can only speak. I think everyone should comment on this, and also someone like Ali from the first panel. I mean, simply from my own experience, there are two aspects that clearly are critical. One is the low capacity, low support for actual research production in Arab universities, as opposed to just training students. And so the space, as we're saying, it's difficult enough, and here, it's difficult enough elsewhere to keep unpopular topics on the horizon. But from my own experience, that's one part of the story. And the second part of the story is certainly the NGOization process, whereby middle class people who could be brokers at a certain sense become, infeodated, even if they're not part of the state, to certain kinds of funding that discipline what they say, even if they know better. I mean, Yemen is, if one, can really be outside, is an interesting place because and also relating that to the military security state, which was really built up. I mean, in the 60s and the 70s, it was disgraceful to be a soldier. I mean, the revolution, too, was led by soldiers. But, I mean, essentially, you had no standing military. This is not, a pharaonic world at all. And the level in which that has been built up and the disciplining that then occurred with intellectuals. I mean, a good friend of mine, Abu Bakr Saqaf, had his guts spilled out simply for what he was by Central Security, and other friends have. There was a huge repression, particularly in the 80s, of intellectuals. So, Yemen has spaces of memory, partly because of the experience of the South, but also the experience that was, and partly because of a greater tradition historically of autonomy. But anyway, I'm now wandering back into the particular Yemen case. But if you take, in my limited experience, it's both, which isn't that limited since I taught in an Arab university for a decade, but and that is, of course, part of the infeodation more generally, is we don't have enough research production that has any side of autonomy from the outside, and then we've had the NGOization on top. But anyway, that's just my own personal experience as two really important factors. But the reason I mentioned the historical memory in Yemen is that there are other political discourses there. It was a society with enormous autonomies and wild dreams, and also a society that stood in a different position than the Eastern Mediterranean does to Europe. I mean, India is there, East Africa is there, And it's the terrible incorporation under the umbrella of Saudi Arabia in every sense of the term that has really been horrible to watch. I mean, painful to watch.
Ray, you wanted to come in on that?
Yeah, but I think the question is important because you kind of wake up in the morning scratching your head thinking, well, how the hell have we got into this mess? Did it happen by stealth, osmosis, or shock? And I suppose the truth is it's happened by a little bit of all three different processes. I read something recently by Colin Lees, who I have great admiration for. And what's the name? Colin Lees, L-E-Y-S. He's written both on development issues and also on especially transformation of neoliberalism and welfare states. And what Colin argued was that basically from the 1990s onwards, the only development strategy that was acceptable to have was not having one. And just think about that. The only development strategy that was acceptable was not having a development strategy. And this coincides with and is driven by the whole process of the kind of things that Ali was talking about in terms of liberalization of economies, opening up of economies, and also the way in which we, in a sense, are not allowed, or and that's just a foolish way of putting it, the way in which class has been taken out of the lexicon for social analysis. If you look at the different volumes of the Waterbury book, for example, that much celebrated, fantastic money earner, The Political Economy of the Middle East, in the latest issue, and that, when I say latest, I think it was produced in the mid-90s, there's no mention of class. It's actually not there. If you look in the earlier issue, there is class. Now something has happened. Now, it's not that class has disappeared, but the analytical efficacy of it as a concept of analysis has been stripped away by bourgeois ideology, by neoliberalism. And that is why the neoliberalism is a revolution. We have experienced, all of us, we have lived through a revolution in our time. And this is a neoliberal revolution which has shaped the character, even of the tools that we are allowed to use. And it also reminds me of a comment I think you had at the end of your presentation, certainly at the heart of Habib's conclusion, and that is, okay, yes, absolutely class is crucial. Yes, absolutely, because it allows us to analyze the relationships of the ways in which poverty is reproduced, which is what I was trying to explore. But also, what does class mean in the contemporary period, where you have in the countryside a set of economic, social, political, cultural relationships where people don't just simply own land or not own land. It's not just about ownership per se, which is what it's about. Ownership, it's about tenancy, it's about sharecropping. It's about some households being engaged in all three of those. It's what Abdul Al at AUC talks about, it calls the tenancy web. Now, if you have people who are engaged in that kind of varied social and economic, political relationships, how do you engage with that person politically? What agenda or sets of consciousness do they have? What do they want in life for them and their family other than the obvious? And with whom will they identify politically in terms of political transformation and reform? Now, in African political economy, we spoke in the 70s, I'm just dating myself here, we spoke in the 70s of peasantariat or worker peasants. Now, do either of those two concepts have any meaning? Are they clumsy? Do they help inform our analysis? Actually, I think they do. I think they're really important concepts. A peasantariat, people who are workers and farmers, they straddle rural and urban, and in so doing are affected by and themselves try to imbibe in a political strategy that relates to their economic realities.
Thank you very much, Ray. More questions, comments, please.
Thank you very much. I really learned a lot. It was very interesting.
Can you introduce yourself? And I'm sorry.
From Yemen.
What's your name?
And my question is, actually in Yemen we have an upcoming national dialogue, and the budget is 7 billion for this national dialogue, and no mention, and the 9 themes, the economy is not one of them, labor rights, workers' rights, farmers, none of that is in the 9 themes. they're not even there as participants. This is in the new Yemen, and it's very depressing for me actually. And a lot of the things that I'm hearing now are just, they resonate a lot to me. And I just want to ask you for maybe advice. Just how can I stay positive, and what can we do really to change? I mean, if the new Yemen is really resembling the old in many different ways, how can we, as activists or bloggers, or the media is not discussing this at all, what can we do, and what can Thimar maybe help us do?
Sure. Can I just say a word here? Because there's been a lot of talk about Yemen, and of course Martha is the big expert, but I have worked in Yemen for long years, both in time and in intensity, as a country rep of a British NGO, which put me like right in the center of taking the role of the state in delivering essential services. In my case, primarily in primary health care, in Hajjah and Reima, and even all the way to Al Mohra after Unity. I was there in the period that straddled قبل الوحدة وبعد الوحدة. And I think, just to go back to Samer's question, how did this happen? I don't think there is one. I mean, there of course is an answer for the whole of the South, and like one big answer, and one tends sometimes to forget the issues of the exploitative relationship that went under the name of colonialism that was established, and that really screwed up the systems, and I haven't heard it. You haven't heard democracy, you haven't heard colonialism. It's not so fashionable anymore, but a lot of what goes on today can be traced, not to be a total aficionado of the dependentista, but I mean, there is something that has happened, and resources that have been plundered and pillaged, and developments that have been, governments that have been put in place by force through military and economic action in order to continue a flow of good from one way to another. And if we forget about that, then we're not seeing the whole picture. Of course, within the system in which we live, there is what I call the compradorial class, half jokingly, but I mean, it is still very much there. And a lot of the people, and in the Arab world, things are different. Yemen is in no way similar. I mean, I don't mean to paraphrase Jeffrey Feltman here, please forgive me, but hey, Yemen is not Syria, and it's not Tunisia, and things have been made to be different than they all are. In Yemen, for example, in my personal experience, having lived there and gone like totally native during a large period, and, there is a ruling elite that's just taken over and watched things go, and just accumulated as much as they could. When I was there, just for you, this anecdote and life and political analysis can have a lot of anecdotes in it that contribute to forming a picture. That a friend came to do the audit from one of the big auditing company on the government of Yemen during Ali Abdullah Saad. That was in the early 90s. And, to audit the government, just so that they can put, they can rank them, so that to see whether they can qualify. And the guy went like completely nuts. He said first, there are no accounts. I mean, there is no book, in which you write what has been taken. But there are IOUs in the big safe of the central bank, like little pieces of paper, and you're Yemeni, that these pieces of paper are really very, very common. I mean, they smell of hilba sometimes. We put them close to the body, but they're there. And like, IOU, villa in Cannes, like, $5 million. And that was a disclosure, and that's how things get plundered. Yemen Hunt used to, and I mean, everybody knows the system, how capital is shared, who is on the paying list of whom. I mean, Abdullah Saleh received money as salaries from, all those big. I mean, this is reality. People who paid them talk about it freely back then, and there was no shame in it. Shatara in extracting this. And then the countryside and the rest and the kind of whoever was in Saudi Arabia. I was there also during the Gulf War when the Nazihin, came back. I mean, you think anybody was interested in this? No one. The country is divided into geographic entities belonging to Western governments. For example, Hodeidah is for the Dutch. Everybody knows that. ريما للبريطانيين. هذا معروف. And I was البريطانيين. And so I know exactly how and things and what the big picture is important, the big talk, but in the reality so the people grab control by force. They fulfill a purpose that is important for the global dominant order. Drone attacks, allowing Ali Abdullah Saleh's relationship with the administration of Bush and Obama and getting rid of, Al-Qaeda, whatever, Abiyan, all of that, scratch my back and scratch yours. And these countries are then kept in semi-death state, which is desirable. It's not undesirable. It's desirable. That's what they want. And so, Syria is undergoing, whichever way you one places oneself, a major de-development. Do you realize what's going on in Syria? If you feel that if you think that Syria is going to stand up and be again any country within the next 20 years, I think you're wrong. And I would argue that point. And Syria has effectively been de-developed, as Iraq has been. But this time, in Iraq, Norman Schwarzkopf died the other day, the battle of... you remember what is his greatest achievement? It is killing 100,000 Iraqis with only 279 American soldiers killed, 50 of whom were killed by friendly fire. That was his greatest achievement. In Syria, there will be not one single American injury. These things have to be factored in with the bigger class analysis and the bigger economic analysis, which I fully agree. But these exist. There are pressures that come, pressures on control, and they're not the only ways, but they exist. Saudi Arabia's interference, constant in Yemen, since time on both sides, by the way, on all sides, is something that has to do with ingerence, control, power relation, etc. So these also need, in my opinion, to be factored in on top of everything that has been said that is perfectly correct and true. But it's not only a class of rich people trying to control a country. There is more than that in it. There is a global, order that is deployed, sometimes very harshly with a lot of blood, and sometimes, in a much more insidious way. Let's have some more, sorry for the intervention.
I think Ali should speak, but for Atyaf, it seems to me with Yemen that also reports from the countryside somehow sounds like nothing. I'm not at all denying, I'm not disagreeing one iota from Rami, but for younger activists who are, when in a sense the central process has been killed, I agree with Zaid al-Wazir, who says get out into the countryside at the moment and simply to open the channels of communication. I don't know that we can do much more than that. And so far as Timar can work on that, I'm just not, because it's very difficult.
We can talk later,
defeat,
outside.
When you're in a period of
okay.
defeat.
I don't think it's that defeat. I don't see it as a big defeat.
Okay, but it's always a defeat.
Ali. For Ray on law 96 in 1992, which you said that actually this has made almost half the tenant owners feel uncomfortable in the relationship of property to the land, and that many have left the land as a result of that. How can you explain just how the law worked, and very briefly, really, also it could be said in a few words. Just what did the law say to basically make the owner of a land now feel that the land is not his, and his toil and effort is going to waste, is not really?
Well, in brief, it was a change in tenancy structure and the introduction of the market for setting prices for annual tenancies. So annual tenancies were introduced, and it was introduced, interestingly, over a 5-year transition period. So the law did not become fully effective until 1997, even though it was on the books from 1992. And the reason why they had a transition period was partly as a result of political pressure and protest, which was pretty much sidelined, but nevertheless it was evident. And there was also a fear that actually doing this in the countryside may lead to a degree of political upheaval. So there was a recognition that this was a pretty difficult thing to promote, but in the end they argued that they did it and delivered it much more easily than they feared, partly because they denied the protest and they denied signatures on petitions, and they did it without even knowing how many tenants there were. So there was very little background homework on the actual process. But the main core of the process was that it introduced annual rents, which meant that farmers who historically had rights in perpetuity in terms of handing land down within their family over a generation, had 2 generations, had actually no longer those rights. So they would worry about what would happen at the end of a planting season, because why should they invest so much in the land that they have if the rent is going to be so exorbitantly increased, and rents increase more than 400% in that 5-year period, gradually and incrementally. So there was a real shift in the character of rural relations or production and the power of landowners who benefited directly from a landowning parliament, actually, who ushered in this reform.
It's worth mentioning, the Ottomans had tenancy rights in perpetuity. There was a large extraction, but they were in perpetuity under the Ottomans, and classical Islamic law always had 3-year rental periods as a minimum. So this 1-year rental period for agriculture is
even one season.
Even to
I have
one season.
That is something.
I have to thank everybody, and I mean, unless there is a burning question, is it burning?
I think, in conclusion, that we can give the title all this work that they are a tragicomedia, and the chief of orchestra is in the United States of America.
Okay. And thank you very much for this. You certainly lightened the mood. And thank you very much for coming. And I thank the esteemed speakers for their tolerance to the vigors of the chair. Thanks to the audience.